Hey guys, tonight we're talking about something you've done 100 times without thinking. Tapping your knuckles against a table, a door frame, maybe your nightstand right before saying something hopeful. Knock on wood, you mumble, as if those 3 words might stop the universe from turning against you. You probably won't survive this habit. Well, not the history of it, anyway. Because behind that innocent little gesture lurks an ancient forest full of spirits, half-forgotten gods, and a church that tried and failed to chop it all down. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're sitting in your room, fingertips brushing against the grain of the table. The wood is cool, faintly smooth with those tiny grooves that catch your skin. You knock twice. An instinct, not a thought. It's a small sound, but if you listen carefully, it feels older than language. You've just joined a tradition that's been echoing for thousands of years, a survival of pagan ritual hidden in plain sight. Somewhere deep inside the wood, in the imagination of long-gone ancestors, something stirred. To them, every tree was alive, not just alive in the way a plant grows, but alive in the way you are. Trees had souls, moods, and most dangerously, opinions. You didn't want to anger a tree's spirit. And so people spoke to them, thanked them, begged them for luck. The Celts, the Norse, even the Greeks all shared some version of this, that inside the bark dwelt forces that could either bless or curse you. It's easy to imagine one of your distant ancestors walking through a forest at dusk. The trees tower and their branches twist together like the ribs of a cathedral. Every creak and rustle sounds like a whisper. When the wind moves, the forest speaks. So when he needs good fortune, maybe before battle, or before asking for a harvest, he touches the nearest trunk, sometimes knocking gently. "Are you listening?" he seems to ask. Historians still argue whether this knocking began as a request for protection, or as a way to hide from spirits, like you might whisper good news and tap the tree to stop jealous entities from overhearing. Either way, that small tap carried the same message. Help me. Shield me. Don't turn against me. A mainstream fact you might like. The Celts believed certain trees, like the oak, ash, and yew, were gateways between worlds. Druids held ceremonies in oak groves, where the air itself was thought to shimmer with divine presence. Touching wood wasn't superstition then. It was a literal handshake with the divine. The gods lived in the branches. A quirky little tidbit, archaeologists once found ancient carvings in what's now Germany, tiny figures etched into tree bark, some half-finished, as if abandoned mid-ritual. Scholars think people might have been trying to trap luck or ward off disease by embedding part of themselves, or their prayers, in the living tree. Like leaving your voicemail with a god who never deletes messages. You might laugh, thinking of your IKEA desk as a sacred conduit. But back then, wood wasn't a material, it was a personality. Even when carved into homes or ships, the belief clung on that a spirit lingered inside, watching, listening. Sailors knocked on their vessels to ask for safe passage. Farmers tapped on barns before the harvest. Mothers laid a hand on the doorframe when sending their sons to war. Always wood, always that same soft rhythm of superstition. And it wasn't always kind. Some cultures feared the spirits inside the wood were capricious, kind one moment, spiteful the next. Knocking wasn't just to summon, it could also be to warn off. Imagine it like politely saying, "Don't eavesdrop, please." You tell the spirits your good news, then quickly rap on wood to make sure none of them twisted against you. If you ever notice how reflexive it feels today, how you don't even think before doing it, that's the mark of a superstition too old to question. It's like an evolutionary echo. Somewhere deep down, you're still standing in that ancient forest, just trying not to anger what listens from the shadows. And yes, sometimes it's funny to realize how these pagan reflexes survived Wi-Fi, skyscrapers, and self-driving cars. You, a modern person surrounded by circuit boards and screens, still trusting in tree spirits. Somewhere a druid is laughing quietly. The church would try to silence those laughs, of course, but that's later. For now, picture yourself at the edge of that pagan grove again. You reach out, tap the trunk once, twice. Maybe the bark is damp with mist. Maybe it's just your imagination that something answers. A soft creak, a whisper of wind. You don't stay to find out. You've done your part, and that's enough. The gesture follows you out of the woods, down through the centuries, into every carved door and polished tabletop you've ever known. And it waits, patiently, for the next time you tempt fate with a bit of good news. Knock on wood. You're standing in the same forest, but now it's alive with whispers. Not the creak of branches this time, but the murmur of belief. You can almost feel the air hum with meaning, like the entire woodland is tuned to some invisible frequency. Every rustle feels deliberate. Every gust of wind seems to sigh your name. You tilt your head. Was that just the leaves moving or something inside the tree breathing? To the ancient world, that wasn't a poetic thought. It was simple fact. Trees had spirits. They didn't symbolize them. They were them. When you touched the bark, you weren't just feeling wood. You were touching the skin of something alive, ancient, and possibly divine. The Celts believed in dryads, or wood spirits, each tree home to one. Knock softly, and you might get a blessing. Knock too loudly, and you might wake something that prefers to sleep. You can imagine the scene. A druid in a white cloak, standing beneath a giant oak, chanting prayers while the wind stirs the mist. He taps the trunk once, like knocking on the door of another world. Meanwhile, in Greece, people whispered to hamadryads, spirits bound for life to a single tree. If that tree died, so did the spirit. So every swing of an axe wasn't just carpentry, it was murder. There's even an old myth about Ersikthon, a man who chopped down a sacred oak despite warnings, and was cursed with endless hunger. The story's moral? Never anger the wood. You can almost hear the joke forming in your head. Knock on wood, or else the tree might knock back. And in the cold north, the Norse shared something similar. Their world tree, Yggdrasil, stretched across the entire cosmos. It held together heaven, earth, and the underworld in one endless root system. To them, touching wood wasn't a random tick. It was acknowledging your place in that cosmic architecture. Every time you knocked, it was a polite tap on the backbone of creation. Historians still argue whether these beliefs blended naturally or spread along trade routes, carried by traveling priests, sailors, and storytellers. What's certain is that by the time Rome started swallowing Europe, the tree spirit idea was everywhere. Pagan or not, you didn't mess with wood. Here's a mainstream fact you can picture clearly. When the Romans built their first wooden temples to Jupiter and Mars, they used specific kinds of trees for each god: oak for strength, laurel for victory, cypress for mourning. Each had meaning. Even centuries later, long after the empire fell, peasants still treated certain woods as holy. Oak for courage, ash for protection, birch for rebirth. You can find the echoes of it in language today. Heartwood, roots, branching out. We still speak in trees. And then there's the quirkier side, the kind of folklore that makes you raise an eyebrow. In some Celtic stories, people used to whisper their wishes into trees, then plug the hole they'd made with moss or wax, sealing their words inside, like giving the forest a secret it had to keep. Imagine thousands of trees filled with tiny, muffled prayers, like an invisible archive of human hope. There's something oddly comforting about that, isn't there? The idea that even before organized religion, people were leaving their hopes somewhere soft, green, and silent. But the church didn't find it comforting. Oh no. As Christianity spread, the new priests looked at all this tree worship and saw only blasphemy. They chopped down sacred groves, burned the old idols, and built churches right on top of pagan clearings, as if to smother the roots themselves. And yet, the habit endured. Why? Because faith doesn't live in doctrine, it lives in muscle memory. People could change gods, but their hands still remembered how to touch the world. When you reach out to knock on wood, you're not quoting scripture, you're repeating an ancient gesture, one that outlived gods, languages, and empires. You can see it even today in the tiny details of everyday life. A football player taps a wooden post before running onto the field. A grandmother touches the doorframe before leaving the house. You, watching this right now, maybe brushed the desk beside you just to be safe. That's not superstition, it's inheritance. And yet, those old believers would probably laugh at what the gesture became. They'd say, "You tap the wood, but do you listen for the answer?" Maybe that's the difference. For them, the knock started a conversation. For us, it ends one. Still, next time your fingers graze a tabletop after saying, "Hope it works out," remember those ancient voices hiding in the grain. Somewhere between the atoms of that wood, between cellulose and superstition, the old gods are still listening. Quietly, patiently, waiting for you to knock. The forest fades, and now you're standing among church bells instead of oak branches. The air smells of incense instead of moss. Wooden crosses hang on stone walls, and candlelight trembles across pews carved from the same trees once worshipped in pagan groves. You can almost feel the irony pressing on your chest. The church, trying so hard to erase tree worship, had built its house out of the very thing it condemned. You sit in the back pew. The priest speaks Latin. You don't understand every word, but you catch the tone. Warning, scolding, pleading. It's the 6th century, and across Europe, missionaries are fighting a losing battle. Not against armies, but against habits. Habits like yours. People still whisper to trees, still leave bread under roots for spirits, still touch wood before hunting, harvesting, or confessing. And to the church, that's a problem. Because every tap on a tree sounds like someone praying to the wrong god. There's a well-documented fact here. The early church launched multiple campaigns against what it called arboreal superstition. Bishops in Ireland and Gaul wrote furious letters complaining that converts were adoring trees and stones. Even in Rome, preachers scolded their flocks for touching doors and beams as though spirits resided within. But here's the delicious twist. Christians were already surrounded by wood in their own rituals. The cross itself was the holiest wooden object of all. Touching wood slowly morphed into touching the cross. It's almost poetic. The church couldn't destroy the habit, so it baptized it. Historians still argue whether this transformation was intentional or accidental. Some think priests deliberately encouraged the association, telling people, "Don't knock on the trees of the old gods, touch the wood of Christ's cross instead." Others think it simply evolved that way, an unconscious compromise between pagan muscle memory and Christian symbolism. Either way, the gesture survived. It just changed uniforms. Imagine a medieval villager standing in a stone chapel. He's been told the spirits in the forest are evil now. But the habit won't die. He finishes his prayer, reaches out, and touches the wooden crucifix beside him. Just a light tap. Old instincts in new clothes. There's something quietly funny about that, isn't there? The church preaching against heathen wood touching while filling cathedrals with carved saints, wooden beams, and giant timber doors you couldn't help but touch. If hypocrisy had a texture, it would probably be oak. But superstition is like ivy. It finds cracks. People adapted the ritual in secret. In some places, they hid scraps of holy wood inside walls, believing it could repel evil spirits. In others, they kept splinters of the true cross at home, touching them for luck before long journeys or childbirth. You can see how the two faiths tangled until no one could tell them apart. A quirky tidbit from folklore. By the 14th century, some monasteries were selling tiny wooden charms carved from saintly trees. pilgrims carried them as protection, convinced each one held a whisper of divine energy. In reality, many were just made from local forest wood. But people swore they worked. The knock didn't care about theology. It cared about faith, any kind that lingered in fingertips. Meanwhile, out in the countryside, peasants went on knocking on barn doors and tree trunks when storms brewed. They didn't think of it as pagan anymore. It was just what you did, like blessing yourself when you sneeze or crossing your fingers before an exam. That's the trick with ancient habits. They fade from belief into reflex, from ritual into rhythm. The meaning erodes, but the movement stays. Your body remembers even when your mind forgets. It's easy to imagine the church fuming over it. 1,000 sermons couldn't stop people from trusting the feel of wood. They could outlaw groves, cut down oaks, ban midsummer fires, but not one priest could stop an old woman from knocking on her wooden door when she whispered, "God protect us." And maybe she wasn't wrong. Because whether you call it faith or superstition, a knock is still a conversation with something unseen. It's almost comical, watching history repeat. Modern people laugh at the superstition, yet still find themselves doing it. We have satellites, vaccines, AI, and still, when we say I haven't been sick all year, we knock. Just to be safe. The church failed to erase it, science failed to replace it, and reason failed to explain it. Maybe that's the real reason it lasted. Not because of gods or ghosts, but because of what it feels like. The reassuring solidity beneath your hand. A connection to something older, steadier. When you knock on wood, you don't just hope for luck. You remind yourself the world is still there, still tangible, still listening. Some historians think that's why the gesture stayed even after people stopped believing in spirits. It became a kind of ritualized humility, a way to say, I'm not tempting fate. A small reminder that luck, like faith, is fragile. Still, the irony lingers. A pagan superstition, swallowed by the church, digested by time, and then quietly returned to the world under a different name. You can almost hear the trees laughing about it. You leave the echoing church behind, stepping out into a world buzzing with rumor, work, and folklore. The medieval city hums, blacksmiths hammering, hawkers shouting, cats prowling for scraps. But amid the noise, the soft knock-knock continues. In workshops, ships, and mine shafts, the old habit spreads like a ghost that refuses to die. You walk through a Cornish mining town in the 1700s. The tunnels beneath your feet groan as men chip at the earth, lanterns swaying in the dark. Someone hears a faint tapping sound deep within the rock. The miners freeze. The knockers, one whispers, they're warning us. In Cornish legend, knockers were little underground spirits, sometimes the ghosts of dead miners, who tapped on the walls to warn of cave-ins. When a miner entered a new shaft, he'd knock on the beams 3 times before starting work, both as a greeting and as protection. A cheerful superstition until you realize how many lives depended on those tiny sounds. It's strange. Everywhere you look, wood becomes a kind of spiritual switchboard. Sailors tap the hull before a voyage, hoping the sea gods hear. Soldiers knock their muskets before battle. Mothers knock the cradle before kissing their child goodnight. The old idea that knocking connects you to something beyond human reach has gone fully mainstream. A mainstream historical fact. By the Victorian era, touch wood or knock on wood had already become an English idiom. The first printed examples appear in the 1800s, around the same time as cross your fingers. It wasn't tied to religion anymore. It was just something polite people said after tempting fate. I haven't caught a cold this year. Knock on wood. The words alone were enough. No actual tapping required. But not everyone dropped the gesture. Travelers reported variations across Europe. In Germany, people said auf Holz klopfen. In Italy, tocca ferro, touch iron. The meaning shifted, but the intention stayed. Some cultures swapped the material, others kept the wood. Maybe it's not the object that matters, it's the act of grounding yourself before uncertainty. And then there's the quirkier folklore, the stories that don't make it into history books. One 19th century diary tells of sailors who knocked upon the mast to wake the ship's soul. Another mentions children knocking on trees 3 times to trap a lie before it escapes. My favorite? A tale from Scotland claiming that evil spirits live in silence, so knocking breaks their attention, basically a spiritual distraction tactic. Think of it as cosmic noise canceling. Historians still argue whether these knocker stories were echoes of paganism or practical myths made to explain random sounds in nature. Maybe the miners just heard rocks settling. Maybe sailors knocked for luck because it felt right. Humans have a way of turning instinct into ritual. You can almost see how the gesture changed shape again in the age of science. The Victorians loved mystery, but hated being called superstitious, so they renamed it good manners. A gentleman who mentioned good fortune without knocking was tempting fate. A proper lady always corrected him with a playful tap. The superstition became social etiquette, polished and polite. By the time the 20th century rolled in, the phrase had traveled across oceans. Immigrants carried it to America, where knock on wood joined a new pantheon of lucky habits, throwing salt, finding pennies, avoiding ladders. And somewhere in that shuffle, the spiritual weight vanished, leaving only the habit behind. But that doesn't mean the old roots disappeared completely. Every time you knock today, you're still reenacting a conversation, just one you no longer remember starting. The Druid's Grove, the Miner's Tunnel, the Victorian Parlor, they all blur together in that small sound. There's something comfortingly democratic about it. Rich or poor, believer or skeptic, everyone knocks. Presidents, plumbers, actors on talk shows, they all do the same tiny motion with the same unspoken logic. Better safe than sorry. And yet, there's a whisper underneath that safety. A kind of superstition that still tastes of bark and smoke, even after all these centuries. When your fingers meet the wood, you feel something solid but strangely alive. You might not call it a spirit, but your body reacts the same way. Some ancient reflex buried beneath the jokes. It's worth noting that science has tried to explain it away. Psychologists say it's a cognitive bias, a way to undo tempting fate. Anthropologists call it a protective ritual. But those words don't really capture the feeling, do they? That tiny heartbeat of relief after you tap the table. The sense that somehow you've just closed a loop between yourself and the universe. Maybe that's what the miners knew. Maybe that's what the sailors, the mothers, and the druids all felt. The wood listens in its own quiet way. And if you think you've outgrown superstition, listen carefully the next time you brag about your good luck. Your hand will move before your mind catches up. Knock, knock. There it is, the oldest sound in human history, echoing through you. You're back in the present now, sitting at your desk or maybe lying in bed, the glow of your screen reflected in your eyes. You tell yourself you don't believe in luck. You believe in science, probability, skill. And yet, when you say something daring like, "I've never lost my wallet," your hand moves almost automatically. 2 soft taps against the nearest wooden surface. Knock on wood. It happens too fast to analyze. A half smile, a half apology to no one in particular. But in that moment, you've joined hands with every ancestor who ever looked at the world and wondered what unseen thing might be listening. The habit has outlived almost everything that gave it birth. Pagan spirits, druidic groves, even the church's iron grip. It outlasted the printing press, the Enlightenment, and the Industrial Revolution. It's older than your language, older than your furniture. It's humanity's longest-running inside joke with the universe. Here's a mainstream fact. Surveys in the 21st century show that nearly 80% of people across cultures and religions admit to knocking on wood or saying the phrase. It's universal now, translated, adapted, but instantly recognizable. A shared superstition hiding in plain sight. And then comes the quirk. In Turkey, people don't just knock. They tug their earlobe afterward to divert the evil eye. In Brazil, they say bater na madeira and give 3 firm raps. In Argentina, they add a cheerful toco madera for luck. Meanwhile, in Iceland, people tap metal instead, perhaps because there are fewer trees to knock on. Each variation a linguistic fossil, a cultural fingerprint on one old instinct. Historians still argue whether our modern version is a direct descendant of pagan ritual or simply a lucky idiom reborn. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe all traditions, if they survive long enough, stop being about what they mean and start being about how they feel. Because that's what you're really doing, isn't it? You're feeling. You're grounding yourself. Amid all the uncertainty, wars, pandemics, deadlines, you still find comfort in something tangible, something your great-great-grandparents also trusted. The simple weight of wood beneath your hand. There's something quietly moving about that. The way an ancient prayer became a reflex. The way a superstition became culture. Every time your knuckles meet the table, it's like knocking on the door of history and hearing a faint echo knock back. It's the echo of a druid's whispered plea in a foggy grove. The echo of a miner thanking unseen spirits in the dark. The echo of a Victorian mother murmuring, "Touch wood, my dear," as her child boards a train. It's the sound of fear dressed up as hope. And perhaps if you listen closely, you'll hear something else too. The realization that superstition isn't weakness. It's empathy for the unknown. It's the part of you that refuses to believe the universe is indifferent. That maybe, somewhere in the grain of this world, something is listening after all. You glance at the surface of your table now. It's not old oak from a sacred grove. It's polished plywood, factory-made, anonymous. But when your fingers trace its surface, it feels warm, familiar, alive in a way only habit can be. And when you knock, even softly, the sound resonates deeper than logic. It reminds you that you are part of something ancient, a species that has always needed to believe it could touch fate, even just for a second. So you sit there, in the half-light, still connected to a world of long shadows and slow roots. You knock on wood, not because you fear punishment, not because you believe in tree spirits, but because something inside you remembers when the trees still spoke back. And now, as we drift toward the end of this little journey, let the sound fade with you. That quiet tap-tap on the edge of your desk becomes softer, slower, like a heartbeat easing into rest. The superstition doesn't demand belief. It just asks for a moment's pause, a breath between words. You picture the wood again, the grains swirling under your fingertips. Imagine the tree it came from, how it stood through rain and centuries, how the wind once moved through its branches like a voice. Maybe in some quiet corner of time, that tree listened to the same soft knocking and understood. It's peaceful to think so, that nothing we do is ever truly lost, that even the smallest gesture, a knock, a whisper, a wish, can travel forward, echoing through years and stories until it finds you. So tonight, before you sleep, if you feel a little uncertain, if a stray thought tugs at you, you know what to do. Just reach out and let your fingers rest against the nearest wood. 2 gentle knocks, the sound of faith stripped down to its simplest form. You might smile, knowing the universe probably isn't listening, but part of you, some deep ancestral part, knows it always has been. Knock on wood. Sleep easy.